Hello fellow Unreal Engine artists, designers and developers, and welcome to the latest installment of this Landscape Auto Material series. In today's episode, we're going to add roughness to our material so that the layers can simulate wetness and shininess depending on the texture that is applied to it. So let's get straight into it. Okay, so today we're going to add roughness to our landscape material. It's a fairly straightforward process, but we need to consider another material attribute while we're doing this. I'll explain that in a moment. And also we'll need to adjust our puddles material function to take account of the varying roughness on the terrain. But before we get going, let's get another material for our ground layer here, because this desert rock doesn't really have any information in the roughness channel. So let's find another one which has a bit more roughness variation. So go into the add menu here, go into Quixel Bridge, and what we'll do is we will download a lava texture which has a little bit more roughness. Now, if you didn't claim your mega scans before the end of 2024, you probably won't be able to do this. So you'll just have to go with the texture you've got or find another texture. But if you have got your mega scans claimed, then carry on as we are. So in the description below, I have put an asset ID for this lava texture. So just cut and paste it in here, and you should find this lava stone ripple. So you can see it is sort of like this sort of lava rock, and it has some variation on the roughness, so it looks a little bit shiny on certain of the raised elements there. So we'll use our medium quality as we have done in the past, and click on download and add to the project. And you should end up with the textures for the display for the diffuse, which is the color, the normal, and then our ambient occlusion, roughness and displacement. So what we'll do is we'll replace our ground layer with these textures. So if you've got your material instance open, as we have in the past on the right hand side, make sure you've got the ground layer expanded, and we'll just drag in the different textures. So we'll drag the diffuse into the ground base color, we'll drag the normal into the ground normal, and we'll drag the ORD into the ground ORD. And once you've done that, you can see now that we now have this lava texture on the ground, but we haven't yet applied the roughness to it. So we'll do that in a moment, but just so we're on the same page here, for the moment I've unchecked add puddles, so I don't want any puddles to show at the moment. We'll address that in a moment. And if you go further down the material instance, then uncheck the add landscape texture variation as well. So we've just got a single lava texture on this ground valley. Okay, and with that done, let's go into the material and start to apply the roughness. So here I am in our material function for create layer, where we do most of the heavy lifting. And in the last episode, we added the ambient occlusion. So what we'll do is we'll now take the green channel, which has the roughness, and we'll do our depth fade, lerping, and plug that into the roughness. So fairly straightforward, as I said. Let's do a bit of cleanup here, though. So this depth fade mask that we left sort of hanging in the middle here, let's move that up here and put a comment around it. And let's also put a comment around the ambient occlusion. Okay, and now if we go down to our displacement section here, we just need to take the green channels for the near and far tiling, and that will be our roughness. So let's just create a little bit of space here, grab our green channel, add a named reroute node. So the first one here is near roughness. And then similarly down here, create a little bit of space. Grab the green channel from the far texture sample, add a named reroute node, and we'll call this far roughness. And now we have those ready to plug through our depth fade lerp. So let's do it between the color and the normal. So just drag some of these elements here and lift them up a bit. We'll correct some of this overlapping in a moment. And what I'll do is I will just take this ambient occlusion section here, do a Control C and a Control V. And we will delete the inputs for ambient occlusion and start to add the roughness reroutes. So we're plugging the near roughness into input A, the far roughness into input B. We'll rename this comment roughness. So we're using the depth fade mask to blend between the near and far roughness, and then we will take this output and plug it into the roughness. So now we no longer have this default value of 1 here, so we can delete that. Okay, so that's pretty much it for our first attempt to do this. Let's click on save and let's look at the landscape texture and see what's happened. It's applied or recompiled the shader and now has roughness on there, but you can't really see much difference. And this is because roughness does not act in a vacuum. It needs the specularity to be set as well in order to determine how light behaves, even with that roughness value. So what I mean by that is a roughness value of 1 means it's fully rough and no reflectivity will take place. A roughness value of 0 will mean that there is reflectivity, but the specular attribute determines how the light is reflected. So a specularity of 0 means that light reflects in all directions, so it's quite diffuse, the way it's scattering. Specularity of 1 means that it will reflect in the direction in which it arrives, so we will act like a mirror. So the reason we're not seeing much here is because if we go back to the create layer, we set our specular value to 0. So what we'll do is we'll provide a control for this so we can adjust the specular attribute. And let's just delete it for now, the input. We'll leave the metallic at 0 and we'll create a new input for this. So let's take that input ambient occlusion intensity and duplicate that with Control D. We'll plug that into the specular and we'll call this specular. And the default value will be 0 as before. So you have to make sure you've got this first value 0 and use preview value here. Click on save. And now what we'll do is we'll go out to the master material. And again, we'll just do this on the ground layer at the moment. You can adjust the other layers as you see fit. And then we need to add another parameter here. So let's take our ground AO intensity and duplicate it. And what I'm going to call this is, I'm going to call it ground, not ground specular, I'm going to call it ground wetness, because that's really what it looks like. You'll see as we adjust this, a value of 0 means it looks as though there's no wetness at all on the ground, and a ground specularity of 1 looks as though it's fully wet. So that's a better term for this parameter, and we'll plug that into the specular, leaving the default value at 0. Okay, let's click on save, and let's go back to our landscape. So shouldn't be any change here because our default value was 0 for the specular. But now if we go to the ground section and we find our new parameter, ground wetness, here it is at the bottom. So switch it on. If I set the ground wetness to 1, you can see that that now looks very shiny. So that's probably too much there. So it's using the roughness here to determine where the shininess occurs, but the specularity now determines whether it reflects in a direct fashion. So what we can do is we can now turn that down a bit. So let's go and turn it down to something like 0.5. Even that might be too much, maybe 0.3. something like that. And you can see when you're facing away from the sun, you don't notice it so much. But as you start to face towards the source of light, you can see the reflectivity of the sun is making that shiny. All right, so that's your basic approach. What we now need to do is we now need to adjust the puddles, because the puddles assumed that the roughness was 1 and the specularity was 0 for the landscape. So now we need to take into account these varying roughness and specular values. So I've now opened our material function for puddles, and the way we did this is that we set up a mask for where the puddles were. That's what comes out of this saturate node here. And for the roughness and specular, all we did is we inverted the roughness and specular values. So we assumed it was roughness of 1 and specular of 0 for the ground without the puddle. And then when the puddle occurred, we switched between the two and made it 0 and 1. So if we switch puddles back on, go back to the landscape and find the add puddles checkbox. If we switch that back on, and wait for the shaders, you can see that where the puddles occur, they're nice and reflective, but where the puddles aren't here, then we have the full roughness again, and that's not what we want. So it's not taking into account the roughness and specularity of the landscape outside of the puddles. So let's adjust that, and then we'll make sure that that is working as intended. So come back to your material function, and what we'll do is we'll delete this lerp and this 1 minus x that was feeding into the roughness and specular. And now what we're going to do is we're actually going to get the material attributes, so we're going to preserve what was there if it's not a puddle. So let's just create a little bit of space underneath here. Go to your get material attributes and add a couple of new attributes here. And we want to get the roughness, and we want to get the specular. So those roughness and specular values will now be fed into the lerp, and then we will keep those if it's not a puddle. So let's just duplicate this lerp node here. So let's do it for the roughness first of all. So let's feed the mask in for the puddle. So if there is no puddle, that's the A value here, we'll just use the roughness that we've got already. And if there is a puddle, then we want the roughness to be 0. So fully reflective. Right, and then that plugs into our roughness value. Okay, let's do the same for specular. So duplicate that. And this time we'll take the mask again for the puddle. If the puddle is not on, we'll use the original specular value. But if the puddle is in place, we will set the specular value to 1, which is fully reflective, and then plug that into the specular. And that should do it. So preserve the roughness and specular values if it isn't a puddle, or set them to 0 and 1 respectively if it is a puddle. So let's click on save, and let's go back to our landscape. And you can see now that we have the shininess back on the regular landscape. And then where the puddles are, you have full reflectivity rather than using the roughness mask for the texture. So that's working fine. So a shorter tutorial than normal today. I hope you found it useful. As always, we've got a couple more videos to do in this series. So in the next episode, we'll look at performance tweaks, or maybe not performance tweaks, but more performance pointers. So I'll talk about what you need to consider when you're targeting your landscape material for different platforms and different uses. So performance in the next episode, and then the final episode will be a series of sort of general purpose hints and tips. So what we'll do is we'll take the material and we'll add a few bits and pieces to it just to refine it and just to add sort of final flourishes and features to it. So stick with me for that, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.